Elara Tanis stretched her arms above her head, feeling the satisfying ache in her muscles from a long day of work. The sun had just begun its descent beyond the rolling hills of Simra, casting a soft golden glow over the farm. The cool evening breeze carried with it the earthy scent of freshly turned soil and hay, the familiar smell of home. The day was winding down, and for a brief moment, everything felt as it should, simple and predictable. She paused as she closed the barn door, eyes drifting over the fields of crops. A deep sense of peace settled in her chest. Life here had its challenges, farming was never easy, but it was honest work. And that was something she could always count on. Or at least, she thought she could. Elara. Her mother's voice sliced through the stillness of the evening. Elara looked toward the house. Her mother, Rena, stood in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the dim light of the interior. Her figure was tall and strong, her posture rigid as usual, but there was something in her stance tonight that made Elara's pulse quicken, an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been there before. "Coming," Elara called back, pushing the strange feeling to the back of her mind. She wiped her hands on her pants and made her way up the familiar path to the porch, where her mother waited. As she reached the door, Rena stepped aside without a word, allowing her to enter. Inside, the house was quiet, save for the soft crackle of the fire in the hearth. The faint smell of stew simmered in the air. "Elara," Rena began, her voice unusually low, "sit down." Elara did as told, taking a seat at the small wooden table where they often shared their meals. Her mother didn't sit. Instead, she moved to the window and pulled the curtain back just enough to peer outside. The tension in her movements wasn't lost on Elara, and she instinctively leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "What's going on?" Elara asked, trying to mask the edge in her voice. Her mother was acting strangely tonight, and it unsettled her more than she cared to admit. Rena turned toward her slowly, her eyes narrowing slightly, as though considering how to answer. "Something's changed, Elara." "Changed? What do you mean?" Elara stood and walked over to the window, joining her mother's gaze. There was nothing out of the ordinary in the sky, just the familiar stars starting to twinkle faintly as twilight set in. The vast emptiness of space stretched above them, just as it always had. There was no sign of the ships that occasionally passed by, delivering goods from the nearby colony. Everything seemed normal, peaceful. Her mother's lips tightened, but she didn't speak. Instead, she turned back toward the hearth, her expression unreadable. Elara could feel her heart rate increase, but she fought to remain calm. "What are you trying to tell me?" "There's a ship." Rena's words were almost too quiet, as though she didn't want to say them aloud. But Elara heard them clear enough. "Is it a trader ship?" Elara asked, still uncertain why her mother seemed so tense. Ships often passed through this remote sector, but they were usually harmless, no more than passing commerce vessels or explorers. This was Simra's charm, it was off the beaten path, far from the galactic center. "No," Rena replied, her voice carrying a weight that made Elara's chest tighten. "Not a trader ship." A chill ran through Elara. She hadn't heard any engines, not even a faint hum, and the sky still seemed untouched. But her mother's expression told her everything she needed to know. "Then, who is it?" Elara whispered, the knot in her stomach tightening with each passing second. The unease in her mother's voice had unlocked a flood of questions. But her mother remained silent for a long moment, her eyes scanning the horizon, as though waiting for something, or someone. Finally, Rena spoke. "Pirates." Elara blinked. "Pirates? Here? On Simra?" Her mother's gaze never wavered. "Yes. They're after something." The words hung in the air, heavy with implications. Simra wasn't a place that attracted attention, not like the bustling trade hubs or the urban centers where criminals thrived. It was a quiet, unassuming planet, miles away from the turmoil that had been sweeping across the galaxy. Pirates and slavers preferred to target more populous worlds, where their actions could go unnoticed in the chaos. But now, here they were. And they were coming for her. Elara, Her mother's voice cut through the silence, soft but urgent. You need to understand something. This isn't a coincidence. They're here for you. A sharp breath escaped Alara's lips. Me? Why? I haven't done anything. Her mother's eyes flicked to her, dark and unreadable. It's not about what you've done. It's about who you are. Rena's lips pressed together as if weighing whether to reveal the truth. Alara felt the weight of her mother's gaze, the gravity of her words sinking in. What do you mean? I'll explain later. But right now, you need to listen to me. Get your things. Get ready to leave. A surge of confusion and disbelief flooded Alara's chest. Leave? But where? What's going on, Mom? What's happening? Her mother's jaw clenched. Get ready. We're not staying here. Not for long. Not with them coming. Alara froze for a moment, uncertainty clouding her mind. Her world had always been simple. And now, it was anything but. Before she could protest further, a low, familiar hum vibrated through the air. A ship. Closer than before. Rena's eyes hardened. It's time. Alara didn't ask any more questions. She simply turned and ran for the back door. Something in her mother's expression told her that there were no more answers to be had. Only action. Outside, the shadows were longer now, and the ship loomed overhead. Massive. Dark. The very shape of menace. And just beyond it, she saw the shadows of figures descending toward her farm. The calm before the storm had ended. Alara's heart raced as she sprinted across the backyard, her boots thudding against the dirt. The distant hum of the ship's engines had grown louder, and the shadows stretching across the fields had an ominous, almost predatory quality. She didn't look back to check if her mother was following. She knew she was, moving with the same quiet urgency, her figure blending with the darkness like she belonged to it. The ship had descended just beyond the farthest barn, its massive silhouette blocking out the starlit sky. Alara's pulse quickened with every step, but her mother's calm, methodical movements kept her grounded. There was no time for panic. Only action. Rena reached the back of the barn first, her eyes darting toward the open field. Get in the cellar. Now. Alara's throat tightened, but she didn't argue. She had never seen her mother like this, always composed, always controlled, but now, there was a coldness to her that felt alien. She knew what Rena was capable of, but the part of her that wanted to deny it, to believe this was all just a misunderstanding, was shrinking fast. Mom? Alara's voice trembled. Rena's sharp gaze met hers. No questions, Alara. We don't have time. With a nod, Alara dashed toward the cellar door. She had never run so fast, not even when her mother had chased her through the fields for their sparring sessions. There was something different in the air tonight, something unspoken, and it tightened around her chest like a vice. The cellar was small and dimly lit, the shelves stacked with jars of preserved food and old farm tools. Alara paused at the bottom of the stairs, her breath heavy in the silence. Rena followed closely behind, sealing the door with a swift motion. The thud of the lock falling into place echoed in the small room. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The hum of the ship grew louder, and Alara could feel the vibration of it deep in her bones. It was no trader ship. It was too heavy, too purposeful. The faint clang of metal against metal filtered down from above, a sound too distinct to ignore. Alara crouched in the corner, trying to steady her breathing, but her mother remained still, her face blank as she watched the ceiling, waiting. The silence between them was thick, and Alara could feel her pulse hammering in her ears. Finally, Rena spoke. They're here for you. Alara stiffened. I don't understand, Mom. Who are they? Why? They're slavers, Alara, Rena interrupted, her voice firm and final. And they'll stop at nothing to take you. Slavers? The word felt foreign on Alara's tongue. She had heard of them, of course, everyone had. But she never thought they would come here, to Simra. But why me? Rena's eyes narrowed. It's not about you, not really. It's about what you could be, who you could become. Elara stood up abruptly, her eyes wide. What do you mean? What do they want? Her mother exhaled slowly, as if the weight of her words was too much to carry. You're more than just a farm girl, Elara. Your father and I, your real father, we made sure you'd be hidden. The slavers know the significance of your bloodline. They know who you are, or at least, they suspect. Elara took a step back, her hands instinctively gripping the edge of a shelf for support. My bloodline? What are you talking about, Mom? You've never told me anything about my father. What? Before she could finish, the sound of footsteps above broke the momentary silence. The door to the barn creaked open with a low groan, followed by muffled voices. Rena was already moving, silent as a shadow. She reached down and pulled a small, worn box from the shelf, an old, metal case that Elara had never seen before. Her mother opened it with a click and pulled out a sleek black pistol, checking the power supply. The air in the cellar seemed to chill. Elara, listen to me, Rena said, her voice sharp. Whatever happens, you stay down here. Do not leave. Do not make a sound. Elara swallowed, the weight of her mother's command settling over her like a blanket of cold. But, what about you? What if they? Rena placed a finger to her lips, silencing her. I've made sure we won't be followed. But if anything goes wrong, you need to protect yourself. Do you understand? Elara nodded, though her heart was pounding in her chest. She didn't fully understand what was happening, but the look in her mother's eyes was enough to tell her that this was no ordinary situation. She wasn't just a farm girl anymore. She was something else entirely. The barn door creaked open, and the low rumble of voices grew louder. Elara could hear snippets of conversation now, the words harsh and unfamiliar. I told you, Drac. No need to search the whole place. We'll find her soon enough. The voice was gruff, seasoned by years of ruthless commands. Another voice, smoother but equally cold, replied, She's here somewhere. I can feel it. The mother wouldn't have stayed unless she knew something. The hairs on the back of Elara's neck stood on end. Drac. She knew that name. The stories she'd heard of him, the ruthless slaver who left no trace of his victims behind, the pirate who didn't just deal in slaves but in souls, chilled her to her core. Elara, Rena's voice was low, tight with urgency. Stay quiet. She didn't need any more instruction. Elara crouched in the corner, her breath shallow as she held perfectly still, listening to the footsteps above. The voices continued to drift down, but their words no longer made sense. Her thoughts were racing, her mind spinning with questions that had no answers. Why her? Why now? What had her mother been hiding all these years? Rena's gaze met hers one final time before she turned and slipped out of the cellar with a fluid grace, disappearing into the darkness. Elara was alone, the air thick with the sound of her own heartbeat. The silence in the cellar was suffocating. Elara pressed her back against the cold stone wall, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. She could hear the distant echoes of voices and footsteps above, but they felt like they belonged to someone else, far away in another world. The pounding in her head drowned out everything else, questions, fear, disbelief. Her mother had left her alone, to face this unknown threat, but Elara had no choice but to obey. Minutes stretched into hours. She lost track of time, the weight of uncertainty growing heavier with every breath. Then, the noise above her ceased. She waited, tense, trying to listen for any movement. But it was quiet. Too quiet. And then, the door to the cellar creaked open. Elara? Her mother's voice, low but unmistakable, sliced through the tension. It's safe to come out. Elara scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering. She didn't wait to be told twice. She climbed the stairs quickly, her legs unsteady but her mind focused solely on the sound of her mother's voice. When she stepped into the barn, her mother was waiting in the shadows near the far wall, her figure tense but poised, like a coiled spring ready to strike. Rena's face was etched with the sharp lines of worry and anger, but there was something else in her eyes, a quiet resolve, as if this had been a long time coming. "What happened?" Alara whispered, her throat tight. She couldn't wait any longer for answers. "Who are they? And why are they after me?" Her mother's eyes flicked toward the ground, avoiding her gaze for a moment. Then, she turned and walked slowly toward the small workbench in the corner of the barn. She opened a drawer and pulled out a worn, leather-bound notebook, handing it to Alara. "Sit down," Rena said softly, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Alara sat on the nearest stool, clutching the notebook in her hands. It felt oddly heavy, the pages inside holding the weight of years that Alara had never known. As her mother moved to stand across from her, Alara opened the book, her fingers trembling slightly. The first page was filled with a fine, precise handwriting, but it wasn't the words that caught her attention, it was the image on the page. A sketch of a man. A face she didn't recognize, but something about him felt familiar. Rena's voice cut through the quiet. "This is your father, Alara." Alara's head jerked up, her breath catching. "My father? I don't understand. You've never told me about him. You've never even—" "I couldn't," Rena interrupted, her voice steady but filled with something Alara couldn't place. "Not until now." Alara's mind raced. This was the moment she had feared. The moment when everything she thought she knew would be turned upside down. "But why now, Mom? Why didn't you tell me? Who is he?" Rena closed her eyes, her face tightening with emotion. She took a deep breath before speaking again. "He was a soldier. An officer in the Imperial Guard. A good man. But he made enemies. Dangerous ones." Alara stared at her mother, confused. "Why do the slavers want me? What do they want with me? What's so special about him?" Her mother didn't answer immediately. She stepped toward the window, her hand resting lightly on the frame as she looked out into the night. When she spoke again, her voice was distant, as if she were reliving a memory long buried. "He was part of a covert operation, something even the Imperials didn't know about. They called it the Exodus Project, top secret, a means of creating genetically enhanced soldiers. But things went wrong. A few of them escaped. Your father," she hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "Your father was one of them." Alara blinked, her thoughts colliding. Genetically enhanced soldiers? "You mean, are you saying that You're not just any farm girl, Alara," Rena cut in, her voice tight, almost apologetic. "You're the daughter of a man who was part of something far bigger. Something the galaxy was never meant to know." Alara felt the ground shift beneath her. Her father, this soldier, this man with enemies in high places, was part of a secret military project. And now, years later, the consequences of that project were catching up with her. The slavers, the pirates, the danger, they weren't just random. They were hunting her. But why her? What was so important about her? The silence between them stretched. Alara's mind raced, trying to process the impossible information. Finally, she spoke, her voice small but urgent. "What do I have to do with this? What's so special about me?" Rena turned, her face set, her eyes hard. "You're his daughter, Alara. That means you have the same blood running through your veins. The same abilities. You're dangerous. They know it, and they want to control you." Alara's heart pounded in her chest. "Dangerous? How? What am I supposed to do with this ability?" Her mother's expression softened, just for a moment. She moved toward Alara, her eyes searching her face. "You've always been capable, even if you didn't realize it. You have more strength, more agility, more intelligence than anyone on this planet. But those aren't the things that make you dangerous. It's what they could make you into. What they could use you for." Alara shook her head, fighting against the wave of fear that threatened to overwhelm her. "No. I don't want this. I don't want to be part of whatever they're trying to do. I'm just a farm girl. I Rena stepped forward, her hands gripping Alara's shoulders. You don't have a choice, Alara. This is who you are. You can't run from it. And you can't run from them. The words hit Alara like a slap to the face. Her mother's eyes were steady, unwavering, and though the fear was there was also something else. Determination. Rena knew what had to be done. She'd lived this life before, and now it was Alara's turn to step into the shadows. Alara, Rena said, her voice softer now, almost pleading. We don't have much time. You need to be ready. They'll come for you again. And when they do, you have to fight. Alara looked down at the notebook in her hands, at the man she had never known, the father who had shaped her destiny without her ever knowing. The weight of the truth settled on her shoulders, and though she felt small, insignificant, a flicker of resolve sparked deep inside her. She didn't want this life, but it was hers to face. And she wasn't going to run anymore. The night air was cold against Alara's skin as she stood at the edge of the barn, her hand resting lightly on the wooden beam. The wind carried the faint scent of rain, but the heaviness in the atmosphere made her think that it was something more, something darker. Somewhere in the distance, the low hum of the slaver ship still pulsed, its engines muted under the blanket of night. It hadn't left. And it wouldn't. Alara. Her mother's voice was low, tinged with urgency, but her tone was calm, like it always was before a fight. Alara turned toward her mother. Rena stood just a few paces away, her expression unreadable, but there was something in her eyes that Alara hadn't seen before, something more than determination. It was the look of a woman who had fought her whole life to protect what she loved, and now, the fight was about to become personal. I'm ready, Alara said, her voice steady, though her heart pounded in her chest. Every word felt like a declaration, one she hadn't been sure she could make just hours before. But now, there was no other option. The slavers would not leave without a fight, and neither would they. Rena gave a single nod and moved toward the back of the barn, where a small, hidden panel in the wall revealed a stash of weapons. Alara's eyes widened as she watched her mother pull out a long, slender blade, a gleaming silver dagger. The handle was worn, but the blade itself looked as sharp as the day it was forged. Rena didn't speak as she checked it over, her fingers brushing the blade with a reverence that made Alara's stomach tighten. Do you know how to use this? Rena asked without looking up. Alara's throat went dry, but she nodded. I've watched you enough. Her mother's lips quirked slightly, almost imperceptibly. That's not the same as knowing, Alara. You'll need more than just skill to get through this. You need to understand what you're capable of. Don't hold back. Not with them. Alara's mind raced as she took the blade from her mother, feeling its weight in her hand. She hadn't realized how heavy it would be, but it felt solid, real, like it was meant to be used. As her fingers closed around it, something shifted within her. The terror, the confusion, the uncertainty, everything that had weighed her down since that first encounter with the slavers, began to settle into a sharp clarity. I won't, Alara whispered, her voice stronger now. Her mother gave a single, approving nod before slipping into the shadows, moving toward the side door of the barn. Alara followed closely behind, her every instinct on high alert. They had no time to waste. The barn door creaked open slowly, the sound barely audible above the wind. Alara peeked out into the dim light. The slavers had set up camp near the ship, their figures silhouetted against the harsh blue glow of the engines. Alara's stomach churned. There were at least 5 of them. Her gaze flicked to Rena, who was already slipping through the tall grass, a shadow among shadows. Alara took a deep breath and followed her, moving silently. The closer they got to the camp, the more the air thickened with tension. Each step felt like it carried the weight of her decision, the weight of everything she was about to become. Rena stopped at the edge of the slavers' camp, holding her hand up to signal Alara to do the same. Alara crouched low, her breath shallow. Her eyes scanned the figures in front of them. The slavers were too busy securing the perimeter and discussing plans to notice them yet. It would be a mistake to wait any longer. Now, Rena muttered, barely audible. Without hesitation, Alara surged forward, her heart pounding as the adrenaline surged through her veins. She swung the dagger in a wide arc, catching one of the slavers off guard. He barely had time to react before the blade found its mark. His body crumpled to the ground in a heap, his breath coming in sharp gasps as blood stained the earth beneath him. The other slavers spun around, drawing weapons. One of them, a man with a scar running down his cheek, sneered at her. "A girl," he spat. "You think you can stop us?" The laugh that followed was cruel, but Alara didn't hesitate. She moved faster than she ever thought possible, her body reacting before her mind could catch up. She blocked a blow aimed at her side, twisting the dagger in her hand and driving it into the attacker's chest. The sound of flesh meeting steel was almost drowned out by the roar of the ship's engines. A third slaver lunged at her, but Rena was faster. Her mother stepped in, her movements fluid and practiced as she took down the attacker with a swift, precise strike. Alara watched, transfixed for a moment, before her attention snapped back to the remaining slavers. There were 2 left. "Finish them, Alara," her mother said without looking back, her voice cold but filled with a quiet urgency. Alara's chest tightened as she faced the last 2. They circled her like predators, but there was no fear in her now. Just a singular purpose. She was no longer the girl who spent her days tending to crops and animals. She was something else, something more. The knowledge of her strength, of her bloodline, surged through her with every movement. She dodged one of the slavers' swings, her blade slicing through the air in a quick, decisive motion. The slaver collapsed to the ground with a strangled gasp. One left. The final man, the one who had laughed earlier, looked at her with a sneer, his weapon raised high. "You think you've won?" he hissed, charging at her with wild abandon. Alara's mind was sharp, her body a finely tuned weapon. She sidestepped his attack, grabbing his arm and twisting it behind him with a speed that took him by surprise. With a swift motion, she drove the blade deep into his side, feeling the resistance give way before the satisfying release. The camp was silent now, save for the soft hum of the ship's engines. Alara stood over the fallen bodies, her breath heavy but steady. She wiped the blood from her blade, her gaze flicking to her mother. Rena stood several paces away, watching her with an unreadable expression. There was no celebration, no relief in her eyes, just the cold satisfaction of a fight won. She gave Alara a long, appraising look. "You're ready now," Rena said, her voice almost a whisper, but there was pride there, too. Alara nodded, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over her. This wasn't the end. This was only the beginning.